I don't believe men were created to be pawns in someone else's game. I believe you're created to be steward kings. Men under authority, yes, but entrusted with real responsibility. Not perfect men, but disciplined ones. Men who rule themselves, serve God directly, and refuse to live in fear. This is king, not pawn. You know, today most men, they won't face execution for their faith, right? At least not in the way that the early disciples did, but that doesn't mean that the pressure isn't real. Today it looks different. It looks like, staying quiet at work, avoiding certain conversations, softening the truth so it's more acceptable to those around you. Could even be like hiding certain convictions that you have to maintain relationships, and it's not because you don't believe, but it's because you understand the cost. And slowly, without realizing it though, faith becomes something you carry privately instead of something you live by openly. Jesus himself, he knew the cost. He wasn't surprised with the outcome of his life. In fact, he told the disciples multiple times what was going to happen to him, that he would be rejected, that he would suffer, that he ultimately would be killed, and yet he did not ever change his message. He didn't soften the truth to preserve safety. He didn't, adjust his path to avoid any form of consequence. But here's what's important. He also didn't go looking for conflict. He didn't provoke, he didn't perform boldness. He simply walked in obedience to his Father. And when the truth was required, as it often was, he spoke it fully. And as guys, I don't think I'm alone when I say there's a moment that most of us realize when we're in some kind of conversation. And, something is said that isn't fully aligned with the truth, and everyone around you just kind of nods along, and there's a pause there, and you feel it, that internal tension. You could say something, but you also know that saying something could cost you. It could cost you approval, comfort, status, even opportunity. And in that moment, you have a choice. You either stay silent or you stand. And I want to go ahead and correct something real quick, because sometimes people think that boldness means being the loudest person in the room. It's not. It's not forcing your beliefs into every conversation. It's not picking fights. Boldness is simply just clarity under pressure. It's the ability to speak the truth without shrinking when the moment calls for it. Nothing more, nothing less. But most men, from what I've seen, they don't stay silent because they lack conviction. They stay silent because they understand the consequences, and they kind of fear those consequences, as I'll get into in a moment. They fear that social rejection, that isolation, being labeled or misunderstood, and possibly, losing certain kinds of relationships in the process. And those costs, they feel real because they are very real. But this gets us into the fear of man, and Scripture addresses this directly. The fear of man lays a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. Proverbs 29:25. A snare, it doesn't feel dangerous, at least not in the moment, because it just says, just don't say anything. Just avoid the tension. Keep the peace. But over time, that fear, it actually trains you. It conditions you to shrink. And a man who consistently shrinks his faith, he eventually, struggles to stand at all whatsoever. Now, I want to go ahead and allow you guys to think of something different, because I'm sure you've experienced this at least once in your life too. There's a kind of man out there who, and hopefully you guys might be one of them, who stays quiet for a very long time. He avoids tension. He avoids conflict. He tells himself it's wisdom. Then one day, there's a moment that comes along. It's clear, it's unavoidable, and he chooses to speak. Not aggressively, not even emotionally, just clearly. And something shifts, not just in the room, but in him, because once a man realizes that he can stand, fear begins to lose its grip. Jesus, when we look at his story, he never overextended. And this is really important, because Jesus did not speak everywhere all the time to everyone. Sometimes he was just silent. Sometimes he withdrew for prayer. Sometimes he spoke in parables. Sometimes he spoke directly. But his boldness that he had, it was not reckless. It was more so aligned. He spoke when the Father called him to speak. He moved when his Father called him to move. That's what model is. Boldness is simply obedience not performance. Some men, they react to fear by swinging too far in either direction. They become confrontational, argumentative, always trying to prove something. Guys, that's not boldness, okay? That is actually insecurity dressed up as conviction. True boldness is actually quiet. It's measured, calculated, controlled. It doesn't need to prove itself constantly. It simply refuses to compromise when it matters. Now, I'm also going to not tell you that the cost isn't real, because it is, and let's not pretend otherwise. Living openly in your faith, it may cost you, and it probably will cost you certain friendships, certain environments, certain job growth opportunities, and other forms of social and family approval. And you may be misunderstood, could be labeled, all the bad things that you're thinking could happen probably could happen. It's a very real possibility, but that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong, okay? It means you're not blending in. And, speaking on this losing approval moment, right? There's a moment that we all realize as men where we say to ourselves, if I stay aligned with God, I may lose this. It could be that friend, it could be a group, relationship. And for a second, let's be honest here, we're all tempted to just adjust, to soften, to delay obedience. But if he chooses alignment in that moment, if we choose alignment in that moment, instead of approval, something deeper forms within us. The identity becomes rooted in God, not in people. This is why serving God above all is so important. Jesus himself said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. See, that's not comfortable language. It is costly language. Following Christ is not about preserving your current life as it is. It's about surrendering it, okay? But not recklessly, faithfully. And here's another key. Boldness, it has to come without bitterness, all right? Standing for truth doesn't mean being bitter or anything like that. You can be firm without hatred. You can be clear without being arrogant about it. I think you could also be, steady and grounded without any form of hostility. There's a lot of nuance here that I think our culture doesn't allow us to talk about. See, when Jesus confronted people, he did so without losing any form of compassion. He spoke truth without being consumed by anger, okay? And that balance matters, because boldness without love becomes harshness, and love without boldness becomes compromise. And ultimately, you don't need to force it, okay? You don't need to manufacture these moments. You don't need to go looking for conflict. God will literally naturally place you in situations where standing up is required. And it's when that moment comes, you will know it. There won't be a question whether the moment will come. The question is, will you stand when it does? That's why we have to talk about this internal shift, okay? The shift that every single one of us as men needs to make. It needs to go from, I don't want to lose this, whatever that is for you, to, I don't want to betray what I know to be true. That shift, it changes everything, because now your loyalty is clear. And I want to go ahead and paint you a picture of what happens when you stand, because when you stand, yeah, some people will reject you. Some people, though, will surprisingly actually respect you quietly. Some people, they'll probably feel challenged by you, and that's okay. But others, they're going to be drawn in by your truth. Well, not your truth. They're going to be drawn in by the truth because of you, because they see Christ working in you. But ultimately, and this is hard too, but it's something you have to accept, you're not responsible for either of those outcomes. You're simply responsible for obedience. Ultimately, boldness is not about being loud. It's about being faithful. It's standing firm when truth is required, no matter what the cost is. Not recklessly, not aggressively, but obediently. Okay, don't shrink your faith to fit the room. Don't perform boldness to impress anybody, okay? Walk with God, listen carefully, and when the moment comes, and it will, stand, because the man who stands for truth when it costs him something is the man God can trust with real weight.